Well, let's see how this goes for the people that call Ted Cruz a racist. I'm pretty sure he's not, so let's check it out here.
Member.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to start with a question for each of the five witnesses. In your judgment, are voter ID laws racist?
Ooh.
Professor Tolson.
Thank you for that question. So it depends. One thing we have to stop doing is treating all voter ID laws as the same.
Okay, so your answer, I want to move quickly, so it depends is your answer?
Yes, that's my answer.
Okay, so what voter ID laws are racist?
Apologies, Mr. Cruz, your state of Texas, perhaps?
Okay, so you think the entire state of Texas is racist. What about requiring an ID to vote is racist?
So I think, sir, that's
Oh, so this is what this is about. Having an ID to vote. Definitely racist. Makes no sense.
pretty reductive. I'm not saying the entire state of Texas is racist.
You just said my state of Texas, so you tell me, what about the Texas voter ID laws is racist?
So the fact that the voter ID law was put into place to diminish the political power of Latinos with racist intent and had been found to have
You're
racist
asserting that.
intent,
What's your evidence for that?
the federal district court that first resolved the constitutionality of Texas's voter ID law.
Okay, so your view is voter ID laws are racist. How about you, Mr. Yang?
I agree with Professor Tolson. Voter ID laws can be racist.
Okay, that's
other
two.
context.
Mr. Science?
There are some voter ID laws that are racially discriminatory in intent.
How about in practice? In intent, fine, you say there's some racist with a malevolent intent lurking in the back of their mind. But let's just talk about it as a practical matter. When I go to vote, they ask me for my ID. I pull out my ID, I show it to them.
How hard is that?
Is that racist?
Yeah.
If the law that
makes no
requires you
sense.
to do that was motivated by racially discriminatory intent
What about the
under
effect?
our
Set aside
Constitution.
Set aside intent. I'm asking about the effect.
Yes, in effect, I think that
Ms.
there are
Reardon.
discriminatory effects from a number of voter ID laws.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Reardon.
I'm going to give the
three
witness
yes.
a chance to answer the question. Go ahead, Mr. Sine.
Yes, in effects, I think many voter ID laws are discriminatory. And in design, they are designed to have that effect.
Okay, Ms. Reardon.
I don't
No,
understand.
Mr. Van Spakovsky.
No, particularly because every single state that has passed an ID law has put in a provision to provide a free ID to anyone who doesn't have one. The turnout numbers
See, I don't
show it has
understand
no
what the
effect, and
problem
I would
is.
remind
wanna
everyone
vote,
that the
get a free
current
ID.
version of the Texas voter ID law for in-person voting, the Obama administration agreed in court, in a court filing, that they were satisfied with it and that it was not discriminatory.
You know, I have to say this range of question actually shows the wildly partisan nature of the Democrats' proposal. The record should reflect all three of the Democratic witnesses invited by the chairman maintained to this committee that voter ID laws
It's racist.
can be, in many instances, in most instances, I think of the various ways they formulated, are racist. So let me tell you who disagrees with that. 35 states across the country disagree with that because 35 states have voter ID laws in effect. But not just 35 states. 81% of voters in America disagree with the radical views proposed by the Democrats and the
That's a
Democratic
lot.
witnesses. Not just 81% of Americans. 77% of black voters in America support voter ID laws. 78% of Hispanic voters in America support voter ID laws. Maldev should think about that. 81% of low-income Americans support voter ID laws.
81%.
And yet, what this bill is about is putting radicals in charge of saying if you require an ID to vote, that is racist and must be struck down. This is all about partisan power. Now,
It's almost like I heard before that they were trying to make it that non-citizens could vote. I mean, that makes no sense.
DOJ has also said, under the Biden administration, that it is not going to presume that that a state acts lawfully if it simply returns to pre-COVID voting laws. Ms. Reardon, Mr. Van Spakovsky, what does that tell you if they say after a pandemic, if you go back to the laws that existed before, DOJ is not going to assume that that's okay? What does that tell you about the partisan nature of DOJ?
By issuing the guidance that they did, it says to me that what they would like to do is make permanent the emergency procedures that were instituted by many states through litigation by the DNC throughout the country prior to the 2020 election. And they would like those to be permanent. And so rather than understand that they are temporary, they are going to go after states that design to go back to their original election procedures.
Well, and I think they also think Democrats did well under those emergency procedures, and so keeping those emergency procedures in place will predictably benefit Democrats. You know, I would note, in addition to disagreeing with the vast majority of the American people, the Democratic witnesses and the Democrats here also disagree with the United States Supreme Court. When I was the Solicitor General of Texas, I represented a coalition of states defending Indiana's voter ID law. Before the U.S. Supreme Court, a group of plaintiffs challenged that. It went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court, by a vote of 6-3, upheld Indiana's voter ID law. Not only did they do so, Justice John Paul Stevens, one of the lions of the left, wrote the majority opinion where he said voter ID laws protect the integrity of elections.
Yeah.
And yet, sadly, too many Democrats today don't want to protect the integrity of elections.
Of course they don't.
And I've got to say there is a view, particularly from Northeastern Democrats, that they look down on the rest of the country as a bunch of bigots and overalls, their Southern cousins who are too oafish to be as enlightened as they are. And I have to say there's an incredible hypocrisy in that states like Georgia and Mississippi have a higher black voter registration rate than states like Connecticut, the chairman's home state. They have higher black voter turnout rates than states like Connecticut. They have a lower gap between black and white turnout than in states like Senator Blumenthal's Connecticut. And in fact, states like Georgia and Mississippi, African Americans vote at a higher rate than white voters, and in Texas, they're basically equal. One of the sad realities of today's Democratic Party is they define race as follows. If you're a Democrat, you qualify. So under the Democratic view, I'm not Hispanic. Senator Padilla is. If you're a Democrat, you're an Hispanic. My abuelo and abuela would be very surprised to discover I wasn't Hispanic. But that's how Democrat views it. That's how the radicals in the civil rights division view it. And I will point out as an example, this committee, one new federal district judge in the state of Texas, Jason Pulliam, is an African-American judge nominated by President Trump, sat at this table, presented superbly. The Democrats had no criticism, and every single Democrat on this committee voted against him. Why? Because they perceived him as a black Republican. He didn't qualify as a black man. And I actually asked, as the Democrats were voting against Judge Pulliam, do you have one basis to vote against him? Anything you disagree with? None of them had any single answer at all. This hearing's about one thing. It's about power, and it's about ensuring Democrats stay in power. That's cynical, and it's at the expense of democracy and the right of voters to express their will through free and fair elections.
I'm going to ask my questions now and just begin by saying this hearing has nothing to do with any geographic discrimination, any idea that one state or another is oafish.
Ms. Paris, as I look at your career, I see the career of someone who has been an activist, and I believe a radical activist. You have waged litigation campaigns and opposed voter ID laws. You have opposed voter integrity laws. You have opposed prohibitions on ballot harvesting. You have advocated for felons being able to vote. As I look at your record year after year after year of being an extreme partisan advocate, I'm left with the very likely conclusion that if you were confirmed to the bench, you would likewise be a radical activist on the bench. Voter ID laws, as Senator Lee just pointed out, you described as the greatest rollback of voting rights in this country. 80% of Americans support voter ID laws. 60% of African Americans support voter ID laws. Do you believe voter ID laws are constitutional?
Senator Cruz, the Supreme Court has said that there are no per se restrictions against voter ID laws in Crawford.
I asked what you believe. I was one of the parties litigating in Crawford, so I'm very well familiar with that case and led a coalition of states defending voter ID laws, and Justice Stevens wrote the majority opinion upholding Indiana's voter ID law. My question to you is, do you believe voter ID laws are constitutional?
Senator, I believe they are constitutional. I believe that they can be constitutional because the Supreme Court has said they can be constitutional, and in Marbury versus Madison, the Supreme Court gets to decide. That is what our system depends on. We have a concept of vertical stare decisis. We have rules of law. We have precedent.
Ms. Paris, just a couple of months ago, in March of 2021, you said that the voter ID laws that had been passed were due to, I'm going to quote you to get your words right, anxiety over the browning of America, and people having anxiety of the fact that certain folks in power are not going to be able to stay in power. Do you believe the 80% of Americans who support voter ID laws and the 60% of African Americans who support voter ID laws are doing so because they're concerned about the browning of America?
Senator, that quote is clearly referring to politicians. It's not referring to African Americans.
Which politicians here do you believe are concerned about the browning of America?
Senator, that context was with respect to state politicians.
So it's only state politicians?
Senator, that context that I'm on record for, we're referring to state politicians.
All right, well, let's talk about politicians here in this body. As you know, I filed an amicus brief on behalf of 11 senators in the Brnovich case. You made a comment that the brief that I filed was outrageous and harmful. Do you stand by that characterization?
Senator, the Supreme Court, as you know, issued its decision in the Brnovich case and struck down, and upheld the restrictions on Arizona.
Okay, I'd like you to answer my question. Do you stand by the characterization that the amicus brief that I filed on behalf of 11 senators was, quote, outrageous and harmful? That's how you characterized it.
Senator, the Supreme Court has issued its ruling
I'm going to try again. And do you stand by your characterization? I'm not asking you what the Supreme Court did. You described an amicus brief filed on behalf of 11 senators as outrageous and harmful. Do you stand by what you said just a few months ago?
Senator, what I said as an advocate when it was pending before the court is not relevant to the issue before you.
Do you stand by it or do you retract it? You have a choice.
He wants to know.
As an advocate,
she stands by it, obviously.
Okay, you're going to refuse to answer me on that. I assume you also believe the Supreme Court's 6-3 decision, agreeing with the position advocated in my amicus brief. I assume you believe that decision was also outrageous and harmful because that's the language you used.
Senator, the Brnovich case is the law of the land. It has been settled.
So you're not going to answer that either?
The law of the land has been settled. What I am going to say, Senator, is that I am pledging to apply precedent.
So at the time you discussed the brief filed by a number of senators on this committee as outrageous and harmful. At that time, had you had any discussions with the Biden administration about being nominated to be a judge?
Yep.
I would need to remember the timing a little bit.
When was the first discussion you had with the Biden administration about being nominated to be a judge?
I would need to reference my Senate Judiciary questionnaire because that's where I recorded it. I don't have it committed to memory.
So you have advocated that felons should be able to vote. Do you believe all felons should vote?
Senator, my work and advocacy has been on behalf of persons who are living and working in the community.
Do you believe currently incarcerated prisoners in jail should be allowed to vote?
Senator, I have been advocating on behalf of people who are...
You're not answering my question. I didn't ask what you've advocated in the past. I'm asking what you believe.
She just doesn't want to answer
Senator,
anything.
the canons of judicial ethics preclude me from answering that question because a situation may come before me.
So let me ask you this. You have advocated in favor of a living constitution, and indeed, as both Senator Hawley and Senator Lee asked you about, you have disparage those who believe in originalism as essentially racist and bigots. How do you think you will be able to serve with colleagues on the Court of Appeals if you have disparaged their constitutional interpretation as racist and bigoted? And secondly, why is it that when you advocate a, quote, living constitution, that somehow the livingness of it always makes the Constitution agree with the policy positions you happen to
Somehow.
embrace. How is that consistent with democracy, to have a judge able to implement whatever policy positions you believe in?
Senator, we have had more than 24 amendments added to the Constitution since it was ratified in 1788.
But that's not what a living Constitution is. A living Constitution means you as a judge, if you're a judge, can change it to whatever you want, and that the voters don't get to speak on it. Isn't that right?
Senator, women now have the right to vote.
We passed an amendment for that. That's a terrific victory, and it was done the right way through an amendment. The living Constitution is judges changing it. Why is judges changing the Constitution to meet their policy preferences consistent with any respect for the democratic process and the ability of voters to decide policy issues?
Senator, it is clear that our great Constitution is one that is enduring. It is clear with things like Brown versus Board overruling Plessy versus Ferguson that evolution happens. It is also clear that our great Constitution establishes separation of powers. There are bodies like this one that engage in policymaking. There are judges that review the cases and controversies that are put before them. I am pledging, by accepting this nomination, that I am going to cease being an advocate, and I would impartially, without reservation, objectively apply the law to the facts of the case and controversy before me.
Well, your record is overwhelmingly to the contrary.
Thanks, Senator Cruz. Senator Blumenthal.
Well said. Well said, Ted Cruz. He's a pretty smart guy, I tell you. And I'm just happy she's not a judge.